1918 to 1919. The Spanish flu pandemic. A global tragedy and a lesson for the future. In 1918, while the world was focused on the devastation of World War I, a new and invisible enemy was silently spreading across the globe, the Spanish flu. This pandemic would become one of the deadliest events in human history, claiming more lives than the Great War itself. Part 1. The origins of the pandemic. The origins of the Spanish flu are still debated. Many believe it began in the crowded military camps of World War I. Soldiers, living in close quarters, unknowingly became carriers of a deadly strain of influenza. By early 1918, the flu had reached the trenches of Europe, spreading rapidly as soldiers moved across borders. But it wasn't confined to Europe for long. With global trade, travel, and the movement of troops, the virus quickly spread to North America, Asia, and Africa, infecting people on every continent. The Spanish flu had gone global. Part 2. Why Spanish flu? Despite being called the Spanish flu, the virus didn't actually start in Spain. So, why the name? At the time, World War I powers like Britain, France, and Germany censored news to keep morale high. But Spain, which was neutral in the war, had no such restrictions. Spanish newspapers freely reported on the pandemic, giving the world the impression that Spain was the epicenter. Part 3. The deadly toll. The Spanish flu hit in 3 deadly waves between 1918 and 1919. The first wave seemed like a typical flu, mild symptoms, quick recoveries. But the second wave, which emerged in the fall of 1918, was much deadlier. This strain of the flu killed quickly. People would wake up feeling fine and die within hours, their lungs filling with fluid as they suffocated. Unlike typical influenza, which usually affects the very young and the elderly, the Spanish flu hit healthy young adults the hardest. It's estimated that the pandemic killed between 50 to 100 million people worldwide, more than all the soldiers and civilians killed in World War I combined. Part 4. The impact on society. As the pandemic spread, entire cities were shut down. Streets that had been bustling were suddenly deserted. Schools, businesses, and churches were closed, and public gatherings were banned in many places. People wore masks, fearing the invisible enemy, and the phrase social distancing became a way of life long before the 21st century. Doctors and nurses were overwhelmed. Hospitals overflowed with patients, and in many cases, there simply weren't enough beds or staff to care for the sick. The death toll was staggering, and mass graves became a common sight. In some cities, makeshift morgues were set up because the bodies couldn't be buried fast enough. Part 5. Why was it so deadly? So why was the Spanish flu so deadly? Unlike other strains of flu, the virus that caused the Spanish flu had mutated into a form that caused the immune system to go into overdrive. Healthy young adults, whose immune systems were strong, were most vulnerable. Their immune response became so extreme that it led to widespread inflammation in the lungs, causing them to drown in their own fluids. At the time, there were no vaccines, antibiotics, or antivirals to fight the infection. Doctors were limited to supportive care, hydrating patients, trying to keep their airways open, and hoping for the best. The lack of modern medical tools meant that even basic care was impossible for many. Part 6. The end of the pandemic. By mid-1919, the pandemic had largely burned itself out. The virus had mutated again, becoming less deadly. But by the time it ended, the world had lost millions, and the global population had been changed forever. Cities that had once been vibrant were left in mourning, and a generation had been marked by both the war and the pandemic. Part 7. Lessons for today. The Spanish flu taught the world hard lessons about global health and pandemic preparedness. It showed us that pandemics do not discriminate. They do not respect borders or wealth. They can strike anyone, anywhere, and at any time. And while medicine has advanced tremendously since 1918, the lessons of the Spanish flu remain just as relevant today. Today, as we continue to face global health challenges, we must remember the past. The Spanish flu was a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of working together to protect it. 1918 to 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic, a global tragedy and a lesson for the future. This is the story of the Spanish flu. Subscribe to Timelines Rewind to explore more untold stories of history.